We are back in our King of My Heart series. All throughout the past year, one of the things I was hoping to model for you is there are so many different things that are vying for first place inside of your heart. And it can be any number of things. It could be your family, your friends, your politics, your work, your success. It could be money. Today we'll be talking about how bitterness can so easily take first place in your heart. If you don't keep yourself in check, if God is not in first place, we go down a quick spiral to destruction. The big idea for this entire sermon series is that you must have God be king of your heart. You must choose to have God to be king of your heart. And the big idea for today is there is no place for bitterness when you call God king of your heart. Again, it's so easy to get distracted. It is so easy for something else to take its place, like a game of chess. You have to protect your king. You lose your king, the game is over. Whatever we call the most valued portion in our life, if it is threatened, or if it is troubled, or if any problem arises, we grow immensely defensive. We stop growing and we lose sight of the truth. We remain fixed where we are. What we learn from Scripture is that if anything or anyone, even ourselves, acts as king, we are prone towards our own destruction. When we choose to have God be king of our hearts, He is perfect in every way. We live whole and complete lives when we trust in Him. And in the stories of 1 Samuel that we come up to this point, we see both good examples and we see bad examples. But they're human examples. The devastating effects of replacing God are evident, as well as the tremendous and life-giving effects of humbly coming to God allow us to see what it is to live an enriching life when we place Him as king. So, before we get into 1 Samuel 22, I know we've gone through 22 chapters. There's so many different stories. I want to give you a short reflection of what happened up to this point. The Israelites, when we first start out, are in a time of judges. They go through different periods of different rulers, but essentially the judge is someone who represents God and appeals to God first, and God is king first. And when the judge dies, people quickly go their own way. They do not train for the next generation well. And the Israelites, up to this point in 1 Samuel 1, reach a point of mass corruption. They are treating God like He's a genie. They're treating God like He's just a vending machine. He's just, if I need something, God, I'm going to turn to you, but I'm going to worship every other god under the sun. And the priesthood is messed up. The people are messed up. And God eventually rejects them. And the Philistines eventually rule over them for a time. Bless you. The Philistines eventually rule over them for a time. And during the midst of this, Samuel, as a young boy, is raised up to be a priest. He is raised up to be a prophet. And eventually he's raised up to be the last judge to rule over Israel. And he represents God well. He serves for 40 years as Israel's last judge. And he leads people back to the right place. But right at the end of his career as judge, the Israelites, all the leaders of Israel, the elders of Israel, come before him and say, your sons can't be the next judge. We want a king like all the other nations. They have it better figured out than you do. And this grieves Samuel, because he understands these people are doing exactly what history has done over and over and over again. They want what is right in their own heart. And now they want a king exactly like they want. So they're given a king exactly like they want. Saul comes into the picture in 1 Samuel 9. He is a super stud. He is the most beautiful man. He's the strongest man. He's the best looking. He's taller than everybody else, and everybody loves him. He is appointed king. He is anointed to be king. And in that anointing, he's given all the equipment to do all the right stuff in just the right way. And then he's approved by all the people. And he's set up for success. And he does great at first. But then he makes shipwreck of himself when he becomes prideful. And he rejects God. And God rejects him. And then it turns into the next anointing of the next king. David is anointed king, but this is God's choice because he is looking at the heart rather than just the appearance of somebody. Inside of David is a man after God's own heart. It is a unique type of person that comes. Because when he's anointed, he is not immediately made king. He goes through a refining process from his boyhood all the way through great amounts of persecution. But in the midst of that, he is led to trust God through hardship. And he's given the equipment in just the right way to lead his people well and continuously point to God. David trusts the Lord throughout 1 Samuel 17 and 18. He fights a giant, and then he goes throughout many battles past that point, and he's successful because, again, his source of help comes from God. And then Saul, his last bit of identity is, I really want to keep remaining king. I want my dynasty to remain in the kingship. My only identity is here. He has rejected God, and he grows more and more bitter. And when he sees the success of David, he desires David's death. So he starts out passively at first. He puts him in dangerous situations. He sends him on dangerous missions, and he tries to bribe him. He tries to dissuade him. He tries to make a mess of his life. But David remains successful. Then he himself tries to kill David through a fit of his rage. And then he starts sending assassins after him. And then he starts sending the army after him. And David is on the run. David has to leave everything. So you've got two forms of bitterness. You've got the bitterness of Saul because his only thing left is his security and his safety and his kingship. And you have David who is losing everything and he's bitter, but he is turning to the right source. Before I explain this picture, this is not blood, I promise you. I found out about this picture pretty recently. This was an art piece that was done in 2016. These two artists created this robot arm, which its design was to entertain people through these different dances. And all the while, it had a brush at the end of its head, and it would have a constant leak of hydraulic fluid coming out of itself. And its design was to keep pushing it back in so it would keep re-regulating its system. And it functioned for about 2 years before the plug was pulled. And in that process, you would see this room get messier and messier. And I thought, this title for this piece is really fascinating. You can't help, or I can't help myself. Can't help myself. I have to add the I at the beginning, English. But I thought it was particularly interesting because it was a piece that was forgotten for a while because it was prominent between 2016 to 2019. And it's resurfaced again because people have identified this as the tragic nature of human nature. We can't help ourselves when we think about all the stuff that is going on in our life. If I ask you the question, when you think of your life as a whole, I'm not talking about just all the different components that make up your life, are you satisfied with your life? Are you? Are you happy? Great. Many people struggle. Because when you ask that kind of question, you start, again, thinking about all the variables. It's hard to think about the overarching element of happiness and satisfaction. You start thinking about school and work and aging and family and friends, mental, emotional, and physical health, politics, finances, stresses, fears, wars, conflicts, hopes, dreams, and much more. All of these, when you think about all of these together at the same time, you try to combine them and try to think, am I in a stable rhythm, and am I in a stable balance in my life? Are things going well? And if they're not, how do I get back there? And just one little problem can easily upset the rhythm. Think about this. You could receive 100 compliments and encouragements in one day, right? Makes you feel real good on the inside. You get that nice dopamine effect. You're like, yes, I'm doing good. But then someone comes along and says, I don't like you. They give you a reason. And the thing is, you don't just think about that. You memorize it. You dwell on it. You obsess about it. And you start thinking, how do I deal with this? How do I get back that rhythm that I have lost? I don't know if that's just me. Do you relate with that? Like, I think about when I worked in retail, I would have great days, and then suddenly somebody would say something awful to me, and I would only think about that. It gets tough, and you start to try to redevelop that satisfaction, that rhythm. But what comes in its place is it creates this bitterness inside of us. This negativity and this problem starts to rule us. And when the bitter seeds are planted in our hearts, we tend to lose ourselves, and we try to justify the things we do past that point, saying, I deserve this. I deserve to feel this way. It's kind of like the robot, we're trying to entertain ourselves. We're trying to entertain other people. We're trying to do our duty until we can't. And at the end, when the bitterness really settles in, when we're trying to do all of this by ourselves, we either burn out, or life comes to an end, or we end up hurting someone or hurting ourselves. And the final thought you might ask is, was it worth it? We're going to see some good examples and some bad examples of how to handle bitterness in 1 Samuel 22. I would say this is probably one of the messiest chapters inside of 1 Samuel, because this is as low as Saul gets. But you see, David starts out right, and you see people taking it to the right spot. First, in 1 Samuel 1 through 4, I said 1 through 5 up there, but bear with me. David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Soon his brothers and others, all of his other relatives joined him there. Then others began coming, men who were in trouble or in debt or who were discontented. That word discontented literally means bitter of soul. Until David was the captain of about 400 men. Later David went to Mizpah in Moab, where he asked the king, please allow my father and mother to live here with you until I know what God is going to do for me. So David's parents stayed in Moab with the king during the entire time David was living in his stronghold. What I see with this is David has all sorts of strategies. He has all sorts of developments of a safe place to be. He has the security for a time. David has escaped immediate danger, which creates a temporary sense of security for him. His family surrounds him, and they may have been afraid as well, but still, David is surrounded by people that he knows. David is surrounded by people who eventually sympathize or maybe even empathize with his plight. They're also discontented. They're in debt. They're in trouble. They've got all kinds of problems, and they understand the effects that Saul has had on the kingship, on the entire kingdom. And they come to David because they trust that he has a better way than Saul, and that they would understand what he is going through. And the interesting word, again, is that they are discontented. They are bitter in soul. What does bitter in soul mean? I think it's like this. What do you do when nothing feels safe? When you feel stuck or trapped and nothing is working, what do you do? And some of you might say, you'll give the Christian answer, I pray. Prayer does not work like a magic pill, though. It does not take the problem away. You're still in the problem. You may have a different focus. But how do you work through that bitterness inside of you? Tough for you. And I was thinking about that all week. I was thinking about, how difficult bitterness can quickly rise in you. One of the things that I deal with on a weekly basis is, I deal with mental and emotional and physical lack of health. Stuff gets difficult. Responsibilities grow. You try to live in multiple worlds at the same time. I try to be pastor. I try to be father. I try to be friend. I try to be son. That's not unique, but it's just in the sense that you live in all these worlds at the same time. Stress builds. You try to do everything for everyone at once, and then all the while, your own expectations start to rise up. My own expectations start to rise up, and I can never meet my own expectations. And it starts to get to this point where I have to say, can I keep doing what I'm doing? Can I meet my own expectations? Can I be the best that I could possibly be? And I eventually have to say, I can't. So I'm left with two choices. Do I stay bitter and angry and try to distract myself? Or do I turn to God and say, I can't do this? You can. You have your own unique way that you deal with this. Depending on how self-reflective you are, you might be dealing with this in different ways. But the question is, what kind of strategies, what kind of safe places are you building? What kind of securities are you building for yourself? David was able to get away completely from his enemy. He could have just waited out the life of Saul. He was set. And sometimes we get these strategies and safe places and securities so set that we can just wait out life or wait out the problem that we're dealing with. We could distract ourselves just enough with imperfect solutions. But the goal is to understand, is what you are building for yourself enough? Or are you just distracting yourself? God provides the perfect solutions. And God does it in a really weird way for David. Gives him a U-turn. But I want to think of it kind of like not just any kind of U-turn. How many of you have visited Michigan before? Anybody know the Michigan left? Ever hear that phrase before? Good. Anybody like the Michigan left? Yeah. So let me tell you what the Michigan left is. It is a forced U-turn. You are not allowed to turn left at a stoplight. You have to take a long median down, and you have to take an intentional U-turn each time. You are forced to take that return. And it's frustrating. I never liked the Michigan left because it was long and, it felt like a time waster, and I come from a Chicago culture where you have to keep moving. Any time wasted is lost time. But it's also reflecting time. It's this idea that you must return. In verse 5, one day the prophet Gad told David, leave the stronghold, leave your safety, leave your strategies, leave your security. You can't wait anymore. Return to the land of Judah where it is not safe for you. So David went to the forest of Hereth. He did not argue with the prophet of God. He understood that God was calling him back, that what he was doing was not a lasting strategy. It could have worked for a time, but God was calling him a different way. And what's interesting about David is he has a vastly different response than Saul. He's surrounded by family. He's surrounded by people who understand what he's going through. And still, all the while, David says, I'm waiting here until I know what the Lord wants me to do next. Saul, who has rejected God, is still in this waiting moment, and we see him right at the beginning of verse 6. He's surrounded by all of his family from the Benjaminites. He has placed all of his family in the highest positions of political power, and they have all the advice that they could possibly give him. They're all perfect little yes men to him. And he's just continuing to entertain this bitterness. He's not waiting on God. He's waiting for his next form of destructive thought to manifest itself. He is playing out all of these scenarios. He's developing clever ideas. And eventually, he's just lashing out at the nearest person. Verse 6 says, the news of David's arrival in Judah soon reached Saul. He knew David was back. And at that time, the king was sitting beneath a tamarisk tree on the hill of Gibeah, holding his spear and surrounded by his officers. This is essentially royal court. He's got a spear in hand. He's holding it as if he's ready for battle. He's got all of his friends. He's got all of his buddies around him. And he's not like, what do I do? Instead, he says, listen here, family members. Listen here, squad, you men of Benjamin. Saul shouted to his officers. He's not quiet. He's shouting to everybody. This is a battle cry. He says, has that son of Jesse, won't even say the name of David, that son of Jesse promised every one of you fields and vineyards? Has he promised to make you all generals and captains in his armies? He's talking to his family and saying, I've got all the goods. I've got all the power. I can give that to you. Is David going to give that to you? He's trying to interest them with power and wealth. Verse 8, is that why you have conspired against me? For not one of you told me when my own son made a solemn pact with the son of Jesse, you're not even sorry for me. Think of it, my own son encouraging him to kill me as he is trying to do this very day. Saul, after departing from God, had become so fixed on his pride and kingdom, along with his bitterness of losing the blessing from God. When David became a perceived threat, Saul had to eliminate him because he was a threat to what he valued most. These bitter thoughts became more and more entertained. He started to lash out not only at David, but his son. He tried to kill his own son. He became so obsessed with trying to protect he was so obsessed. Wow. He was so obsessed with trying to protect what was most important to him that he could no longer see what truth was. He started to believe in conspiracies. He started to believe in his own stories. Truth became muddy. Saul couldn't even say David's name anymore. He was so easily triggered. Disassociation became his survival mechanism for his evil. Saul, in fits of rage, rants and complaints about David. He complains about him to his closest companions. And I imagine with how crazed he has become, he could have easily lashed out at his own family around him. He was at a breaking point. He was about to accuse his own family of being conspirators against him as well. This is what bitterness does. It becomes corrosive, and the more you encourage it, the more you entertain it, the more damaging it can become. But then we get this picture of Doeg the Edomite. He first came in 1 Samuel 21. And you see him, he's kind of this side character when David is engaging with the priest of the Lord. And Doeg, it's said that he is detained before the Lord, which likely is he is either stuck working in the church or he is jailed within the church for something he did wrong. So he's stuck. He doesn't know what to do. But he's listening for any little way he can get out. And Doeg, when you read this portion in verses 9 through 10, you might say he's just an eyewitness. He's just stating the facts. It says, then Doeg the Edomite, who was standing there with Saul's men, spoke up. When I was in Nob, he said, I saw the son of Jesse talking to the priest, Ahimelech, son of Ahitub. Ahimelech consulted the Lord for him. Then he gave him food and the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Again, you could treat this as just like understanding the facts of what happened. But Doeg is saying the right thing at the right time to cause the right amount of damage in the greatest way possible. Now, I have no picture of Doeg, but one of the things in all the shows that I ever watched and all the books that I've ever read, this character from a show called Monster is the most evil character I have ever seen. He's master manipulator. He is as conniving as he can possibly be. He is charismatic in a way where people like him, but then he twists truth in such a way where he sees the greatest amount of destruction possible. He gets out of every situation because he is as cunning as possibly can be. And, he's got this backstory that's all tragic and, it's sad how he's come to this point. And at the very end of the story, I'll give you a little spoiler. He realizes how messed up his life was. And he gets flashes of all the bad stuff that he's done. But all the while in all of this, every situation that he's in, he masterfully manipulates conversations in a way where he's able to make people do the worst things possible. This is Doeg. He sees the worst possible result that he can possibly get to destroy the priests and cause the greatest amount of destruction. Whether this is revenge or not, or him seeking glory and fame as we saw in Psalm 52, either way, he is causing an immense amount of destruction, as we'll see. In verse 11, it says, King Saul immediately sent for Ahimelech and all of his family, who served as priests at Nob. When they arrived, Saul shouted at him, "Listen to me, you son of Ahitub." And Ahimelech says, "What is it, my king?" Notice he says, son of Ahitub. He's already disassociating from this person because he's identified him as an enemy. Saul says, "Why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me?" Saul demanded, "Why did you give him food and a sword? Why have you consulted God for him? Why have you encouraged him to kill me, as he is trying to do to this very day?" Saul is already in full-blown mode. He's already developed this guilty until proven innocent kind of model. You have to prove your innocence in this point. I mean, it's supposed to be flipped. You're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. But Saul's already got the narrative all painted out. And it's very hard to convince somebody when you are very set in your ways. If your bitterness grows that deep, any narrative that you have painted for yourself is hard to break out of unless you realize that you are the problem. Ahimelech, though, he's remaining respectful. He humbles himself before the king. He calls him my king. He remains faithful and loyal. All of the normal duties of the priests are wrapped up in a scheme invented by Saul, providing food, providing the right amount of survivability, inquiring before the Lord. These are normal priestly duties. Taking care of the people that come before you and are inquiring before God. This is normal. He even says in the next couple of verses, this was a regular practice for David. He regularly sought God. But instead, Saul thinks this is all a big conspiracy. Thinking that anything that is done amongst the priesthood now is a design to remove Saul from the kingship. He thinks that all the priests are involved in this. He already knows that God is against him and God has rejected him, so he is seeking anyone that is unconditionally loyal to him, and he lashes out against anyone that isn't, even if it is just something he perceives. Even still, Ahimelech stands by the truth. He tries to reframe the situation similar to how Jonathan did in a handful of chapters ago when he reminds Saul of the truth, and Saul is convinced at that point, but the bitterness grows deeper. Ahimelech says, "But sir, is anyone among all your servants as faithful as David? He is your son-in-law." There's a lot of faithfulness right there already off the get-go. He's already related to the king. Then he says, he is the captain of your bodyguard. He is highly honored as a member of your household. This is certainly not the first time I had consulted God for him. May the king not accuse me and my family in this matter, for I knew nothing at all of any plot against you. Ahimelech, whether he understood the fullness of the situation or not, regards David as faithful, as loyal, as trustworthy. And he's trying to ground Saul again in that reality. He reminds Saul that his duty is to inquire before the Lord those who seek it, which David did on a regular basis. He knew that David was innocent, and if he wasn't, anything David did or how he acted did not match what Saul was saying. When David came before him in the previous chapter, he did not display the desire to seek Saul's death. So Ahimelech is purporting everything that he knows based on the example that David has set. The problem is, even though Ahimelech is grounded in truth and righteousness, Saul's bitterness lashes out and becomes destructive. He doesn't care because he's unwilling to listen to reason or truth. If he cannot see that he is the issue, he will continue to think that anything he does or says is justified. So here's the question, friends. Think of the bitterness in your own heart. You all have different stories that you deal with. You have all sorts of different problems and stresses and worries and fears that have come up to this point. You know your own story. The bitterness that you are hanging on to, do you believe that? When you are hanging on to bitterness, do you believe that you are the problem? I'm not saying that the problem that has come up to that point is not justified, but the bitterness that you are hanging on to is the problem. Injustice can be done to you. That's not the right portion. That can be validated as a problem, but again, you must recognize the bitterness that you hang on to and how that can jail your heart and destroy you and corrode any goodness or truth that can help you grow to the next point. We go on in 1 Samuel 22:16. Saul says, "You will surely die in Ahimelech, all and your entire family," the king shouted, and he ordered his bodyguards, "Kill these priests of the Lord." Wow. For they are allies and conspirators with David. They knew he was running away from me, but they didn't tell me. But Saul's men refused to kill the Lord's priests. Then the king said to Doeg, "You do it." So Doeg, I'm sure, was like, okay. Grabs the sword, turns on all the priests, kills each and every one of them, 85 priests in all, still wearing their priestly garments. That's significant because they were in active duty of preparing any kind of sacrifices, any kind of incense, any kind of praise before the Lord. They were in active duty. Then he went to Nob. He traveled an hour away, and he slayed the entire town of priests. He killed the priests' families, men and women and children and babies, and all the cattle, donkeys, sheep, and goats. It was an ugly scene. And if you rewind back to 1 Samuel 15, when Saul was on mission for God, he was told to wipe out an entire nation that had gone far away from God, doing horrible and awful things. It was supposed to be a complete ban of an entire group of people. And it sounds bad, but this was God's justice in a very unique way. Saul doesn't do it. Saul is rejected. And here, in 1 Samuel 22, he does that same kind of ban against God's own priests and God's own people. He sends God's very enemy, a foreigner who specifically hates the Israelites, to kill his own people. It's about as twisted as it can get. It's not good. This is what bitterness looks like when you let it win. What we do is we allow corrosiveness to grow in our hearts when bitterness stays, and it grows so much point that we start blaming everyone and anyone else other than ourselves, and then we eventually say, "It's your fault, God." And you start lashing out in many different ways past that point. And this has been this way since the beginning. In Genesis 4, 2 through 7, we see when Cain is born and he's grown up, Cain and Abel both are shepherds and cultivators of the field. And in verse 3 it says, "When it was time for the harvest, Cain presents some of his crop as a gift to the Lord. Abel also brought a gift, the best portions of the firstborn lamb from his flock. The Lord accepted Abel and his gift, but did not accept Cain and his gift, and this made Cain very angry, and he looked dejected." Cain didn't give of his best. So the Lord speaks specifically to Cain, and he says, "Why are you angry? Why do you look so dejected? You will be accepted if you do what is right, but if you refuse to do what is right, then watch out. Sin is crouching at the door, eager to control you. You must subdue it and be its master." The word control is also the word desire, and it's very rarely used in Scripture, but this desire is a domineering kind of thing. Sin is just like that. If it enters your life, it can consume you. If you entertain it, it can control you. If it controls you, you lash out. If you lash out, you ruin yourself and you ruin people around you. It makes shipwreck of your life so very fast. It's been like that since the beginning. It hasn't stopped to this day. You must subdue sin. You must subdue bitterness. You must master this, or the desires will destroy you. 1 Samuel 22, 20 through 23. One member of this priesthood escapes, Abiathar, one of the sons of Ahimelech. He escaped and fled to David. And when he told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord, David exclaimed, "I knew it. When I saw Doeg the Edomite that day, I knew he was sure to tell Saul, 'Now I have caused the death of all your father's family. Stay here with me. Don't be afraid. I will protect you with my own life, for the same person wants to kill us both.'" This is very unique in the sense that David understands he did something wrong. It could have been very easy to say, it's Saul's fault. It could have been very easy to say, it's Doeg's fault. It could have been very easy to say, you guys should have known better. You know what Saul's example was like. He could have blamed the entire priestly group. Instead, he says, I was part of the problem. My lie led to your devastation. Instead of blaming Saul and all of the others, he takes accountability for his actions and takes responsibility. And I wanted to share a short story from this book, Extreme Ownership. There was this Marine named Jocko Willink. He shares right at the beginning of his book, they got into this tragic situation where they couldn't recognize the enemy that they were fighting. They didn't know the men that they were fighting in Afghanistan. They didn't understand who they were fighting in the moment because of obscurity in the war. And they ended up fighting their allies. It was a blue-on-blue situation. Many lives were lost, and at the very end, all of the higher-ups came before their team, and Jocko comes before all of his men, and he poses the question, who is at fault? And it's silent for a while. Until some hands start going up, saying, I'm at fault because I did not fulfill my role in just the right way. Or it's my fault, I missed something here or there. And a handful of other people raise their hand and they say it's my fault, but each time Jocko says, no, that's not it. And eventually he points to himself and says, it's my fault. I was the leader, and I failed you. And I will never let this happen again, because we will build better structures, and we will build better systems, and we will help each other to build a better team to do this more successfully. He took ownership of what went wrong. Let me tell you, it's incredibly difficult to do this, to take extreme ownership of a situation when you know that you are wrong. When you are in dire straits, when you are in a very problematic situation, even if it's tiny, taking ownership of your responsibility and what happens next can radically shape what your future looks like. You either let bitterness control you, or you take ownership of your situation. And what more, if it was just that, just taking ownership, that would be an incomplete thought. In 1 Peter 3, 8 through 18, it talks about this idea of a defense for hope. It's not just a defense of faith. You can have faith in God, but you need to have a defense of your hope. What are you hanging on to? 1 Peter 3, 8 through 18 says, "Finally, all of you should be of one mind. Sympathize with each other. Love each other as brothers and sisters. Be tender-hearted. Keep a humble attitude. Don't repay evil for evil. Don't retaliate with insults when people insult you. Instead, pay them back with a blessing." And that is what God has called you to do. And he will grant you his blessing, for the scriptures say, if you want to enjoy life and see many happy days, keep your tongue from speaking evil and your lips from telling lies. Turn away from evil and do good. Search for peace and work to maintain it. The eyes of the Lord watch over those who do right, and his ears are open to their prayers, but the Lord turns his face against those who do evil. Now, who will want to harm you? If you are eager to do good, but even if you suffer for doing what is right, God will reward you for it. Do not worry. So don't worry or be afraid of their threats. Instead, you must worship Christ as Lord of your life. And if someone asks you about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. But do this in a gentle and respectful way. Keep your conscience clear. Then, if people speak against you, they will be ashamed when they see what a good life you live because you belong to Christ. Remember, it is better to suffer for doing good, if that is what God wants, than to suffer for doing wrong. So the question I want to propose to you here before the final verse is, what does your example and testament of hope show to those who see and engage with you? In your work, in your school, wherever you go amongst your family and friends, even if you're shopping or just amongst those who are serving you food. Wherever you go, what does your testament show? What does your example show? Is your example that of bitterness and the frustrations of life? Or are you showing the hope that comes exclusively from Jesus, who has radically transformed you and changed you and given you a hope that lasts forever, security that lasts forever, a strategy that lasts forever, a safe place that is only found in Christ, that again lasts forever? Final verse. Christ suffered for our sins once and for all. He never sinned, but he died for sinners to bring you safely home to God. He suffered physical death, but he was raised to life in the Spirit. That's the hope that you have, friends. That is what you can hang on to. You must defend that hope. That is what you can tell your bitterness. But the big idea today, and Taj, you can come up. There's no place for bitterness when you call God King of your heart. The bottom line I want to give you today is you cannot hang on to bitterness. You must know who and where to take it to. When you trust in your safety, security, and strategies, they only last until they don't. You must turn to God. When you are bitter, you will not change until you recognize that you are the problem, that you are responsible for your own bitterness. And instead of trying to just defend your faith, instead of just trying to defend your situation, remain faithful and defend the hope that you have first had when you placed your faith in Jesus. My challenge to you this week is, in situations where you get angry, and you probably will get angry this week, or you probably will get down in some way this week, I would encourage you to work through these three questions. Where did this start? And why am I angry and down in the first place? Second, how can I take ownership of this? And third, who can I take this to? And do I trust God with this situation too? It's tough. Bitterness is corrosive, and it works fast. It doesn't take much. That is why we have to be good defenders of our hope that we have. God has given us all the equipment to fight against this. The question now is, are you willing to keep fighting, or will you let bitterness control you? Join us for our last song.